I am my mother's lawyer." The words didn't just fill the courtroom, they shattered it. Like thunder ripping through a clear blue sky, the declaration forced Judge Harrison to stop mid-page and peer over his glasses at the source. Standing beside his mother, a 9-year-old boy in an oversized blazer, thin-framed glasses perched on his nose, spoke with a steadiness that silenced the room. David Thompson wasn't just speaking, he was taking the floor. Janet Thompson, a weary nursing assistant who had fought tooth and nail for her son, looked down at him with a mixture of fear and awe. Across the courtroom, Robert Wellington III, real estate mogul, power-drenched millionaire, and David's biological father, choked on his designer coffee. "I'm sorry, young man," the judge said cautiously, voice laced with courtroom authority, "but this is a legal hearing between adults." "I know, Your Honor," David replied, not missing a beat. "And I also know that according to Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by the United States, I have the right to express my opinion on matters that directly affect me." He adjusted his glasses, reached into his backpack, and pulled out a dog-eared school notebook covered in scribbles. "And this case most definitely affects me." The courtroom froze. No gavel needed. Silence descended like a curtain. Robert Wellington turned beet red, throwing a sharp glance at his expensive legal team. No one had prepared for this. A child citing international law and claiming his own voice. Janet had raised David alone, working 60 hours a week to keep food on the table and hope alive. In the 8 years since Robert had found out he was a father, he'd visited David just 4 times, always bearing gifts with no real presence. Now, suddenly, the man who barely knew his son wanted full custody. Dr. Mitchell, Robert's lead attorney, cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child has no legal capacity to." "But I do have something you're all missing," David interrupted calmly, sending murmurs through the courtroom. "If anyone in this room truly cared about my well-being, they'd want to hear what I have to say instead of trying to silence me." Robert leaned in to whisper to his attorney, but David was already flipping open his notebook. "I have prepared a documented presentation explaining why I should stay with my mother," he said, his eyes locking onto Robert's for the first time, "including evidence of the petitioner's true motives." Suddenly, Robert's confidence faltered, his posture stiffened, and his face paled visibly. What had this kid found? And how had a 9-year-old managed to outprepare 2 of Chicago's top attorneys? Everyone in that courtroom was witnessing something unprecedented, something unforgettable. A child wielding knowledge not as a weapon, but as a shield. And behind that shield, hidden among the pages of a notebook, were truths capable of shaking empires. If this story is already stirring something in you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what David was about to uncover would not only change his fate, but possibly change how justice hears the voices of children forever. Dr. Mitchell tried to recover. "Your Honor, while we admire the child's passion, this court deals with complex legal matters requiring proper representation." David didn't flinch. He closed his notebook with a snap that echoed through the chamber like a gavel. "Then why didn't you provide one for me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "In the last 8 months of this case," he continued, "no one thought to ask the opinion of the person this decision affects the most." Robert shifted again. The boy's calmness was unnatural, unnerving. He didn't tremble in front of lawyers in $1,000 suits. He wasn't swayed by courtroom theatrics. Janet whispered, "David, maybe we should let the lawyers." "What lawyers, Mom?" David gently cut her off. "We can't afford someone like Dr. Mitchell. Either I speak for us, or no one does." And then Robert finally spoke. "David, son, I know this is confusing." "Don't call me son," David said sharply, the iciness in his voice cutting through the room. "In the last 9 years of my life, you've shown up exactly 4 times. 2 birthdays, always 3 weeks late. 1 Christmas, when you squeezed in 20 minutes between social events. And once, just once, when a newspaper article on philanthropic fathers needed a photo of you with a child." The room fell silent again. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but David went on. "The last time you visited, 6 months ago, you stayed 15 minutes. just long enough to criticize our furniture, complain about the medicine smell from the hospital where Mom works, and tell me I might have potential if I got a proper education. He adjusted his glasses again. Interestingly, 2 weeks after that, you filed for custody. Dr. Mitchell whispered something urgent to Robert, but the boy's momentum was unstoppable. Your Honor, I did some research. My biological father recently lost a major lawsuit against his business partners. His third wife has filed for a contested divorce. And David paused, letting the tension build like a master orator. I found some intriguing details about a trust fund left by my late paternal grandmother. Robert's face drained of all color. Even his lawyers looked stunned. How on earth had a 9-year-old uncovered financial details buried beneath legal red tape? How had a boy with no resources gained access to information even they hadn't unearthed? David smiled, not the innocent smile of a child, but the sly grin of someone holding royal flushes in a room full of bluffers. But before we talk about inheritances and ulterior motives, he said, closing his notebook, let's first discuss why a man who never cared to be a father suddenly developed such strong parental instincts. Now sweating visibly, Robert looked like a defendant rather than a petitioner. His attorneys were rattled. Their scripts had no space for a child prosecutor. Judge Harrison leaned forward, the years of court experience giving way to genuine curiosity. David, he said, you mentioned evidence. What kind of evidence could a 9-year-old possibly gather? David adjusted his glasses once more, that now iconic gesture anchoring his poise. Your Honor, since I learned about this lawsuit 3 months ago, I've spent every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon at the Central Public Library. Dr. Mitchell snorted dismissively. Researching what exactly? David flipped to a fresh section of his notebook. Public records, newspaper archives, corporate filings, Mr. Wellington's previous court cases, and copies of his charitable donations, especially the ones made to educational institutions shortly before this custody petition was filed. The courtroom gasped. Robert was now visibly trembling, his empire of wealth and polished reputation crumbling under the weight of a child's determination. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted, not through money or prestige, but through clarity, truth, and the unshakable voice of a boy who refused to be ignored. The head librarian, Ms. Rodriguez, has a master's degree in information science, David said, lifting his chin slightly as if invoking a silent mentor. She taught me how to access basic legal databases. His voice remained even, not boastful, just factual, measured, surgical. Janet stared at her son, as if seeing him for the first time. For months, he had said he was working on a school project at the library. She never imagined that project was a meticulously planned legal campaign to save their family from being torn apart. Robert Wellington finally lost the composure his lawyers had fought so hard to maintain. This is absurd, he snapped, his voice cracking. A 9-year-old boy digging into my private life like some kind of child investigator. Public information, sir, David replied calmly, without looking up from his notes. All perfectly legal and accessible to any American citizen, regardless of age. Across town, in the quiet halls of the Central Public Library, Mrs. Rodriguez had become more than just a librarian to David. She had become his quiet co-conspirator. The first time he approached her, asking about how family courts work, she saw through the facade immediately. That wasn't academic curiosity. That was desperation wearing the mask of determination. That boy's been coming here religiously for 3 months, she had told Janet just the week before, after finally calling in concern. He reads legal codes like other kids read comic books. He's learning too fast to be normal. Back in the courtroom, David continued his presentation like a seasoned attorney. I've discovered that in the last 18 months, Mr. Wellington has faced 3 significant lawsuits, he said, flipping a page. He lost a $2.3 million dispute with former partners in Wellington Industries. His current wife, his third, has filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, legal code reference, concealment of assets, and emotional abandonment. Robert's face flushed a dark crimson. How dare you? And more interestingly, David interrupted, flipping another page in his spiral notebook, With robotic precision, I discovered that my late paternal grandmother, Eleanor Wellington, established a trust fund of $1.70 million specifically for me. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the faint scribble of a stenographer's pen stopped. David looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. The fund is accessible only under two conditions: when I turn 18, or if my biological father obtains full legal custody before that. Dr. Mitchell whispered furiously into Robert's ear, but Robert was frozen in place, like a man standing on a collapsing bridge, watching the cracks form beneath his feet. David's voice remained steady. "Your Honor, this isn't coincidence. My grandmother passed when I was 2 years old. For the first 7 years of my life, Mr. Wellington never even acknowledged my existence to her, never took me to meet her, never allowed her to know she had a grandson." Janet remembered it with painful clarity. Robert had looked her dead in the eye and said, "My family doesn't need to know about it." He had referred to his own child as it. But when Mrs. Eleanor Wellington discovered my existence through her own private investigation, something I verified in her estate records, she took action, David said, voice rising just enough to command the room. She set up the trust with a very specific clause. The money would be used for my education and welfare only if my father demonstrated genuine commitment to my care by seeking custody. Otherwise, the money would go directly to me, without his access, when I turned 18. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Robert had ignored his son for nearly a decade. Now, facing financial ruin and legal battles, he had returned, not out of love, but desperation. "But there's something my grandmother couldn't have foreseen," David said, closing his notebook with another sharp snap. She didn't know her son would grow into a man who built a career out of exploiting struggling families through predatory practices. Dr. Mitchell stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is getting entirely out of hand. The child is making baseless accusations." "I can prove everything I'm saying," David interrupted, unfazed. From his backpack, he withdrew a manila folder thicker than anyone expected. "And here, I have copies of 17 lawsuits over the past 5 years. In every case, Wellington Industries purchased properties from financially distressed families, well below market value, using insider information obtained from contacts at local banks." He opened the folder and handed a stack to the bailiff. "Here are photos of one such family, the Santos family, Mexican immigrants who worked 18-hour days running a bakery. Mr. Wellington found out, through a bank friend, that they were 3 months behind on their loan after their youngest son was hospitalized. He bought the property, shut down the bakery, and sold it for triple the price 6 months later." Robert Wellington looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His palms were visibly sweating. His lawyer sat frozen, unable to spin this tidal wave of truth into anything defensible. "This has nothing to do with," Robert finally barked. "It has everything to do with this," David said sharply, slapping the folder shut. "It shows a pattern. A man who preys on vulnerable families for profit. And now, he's trying to prey on his own." Judge Harrison was no longer even trying to conceal his reaction. He leaned forward, flipping through the documents David had presented. The weight of it, the volume, the credibility, the precision, was astonishing. "David," he said, voice hushed with growing respect, "where exactly did you get all this?" "Public court records, newspaper archives, business and corporation documents available through the Secretary of State's database. Ms. Rodriguez taught me that the truth is almost always public," David said. "We just have to know where to look." Dr. Mitchell made one last attempt. "Even if these allegations were true, which we categorically deny, it doesn't change the fact that my client can provide better educational and social opportunities for the child." David turned to the judge, smiling for the first time, not with arrogance, but quiet conviction. "That's the thing, Your Honor," he said. "I've already received the most important education I could ever ask for. How to stand up for what's right, even when no one expects you to." He walked forward, folder still in hand, and placed it gently on the judge's bench. "My mother may not be wealthy, but she taught me to read when I was 3. She taught me to keep my promises. She taught me never to trade truth for comfort. I don't need a mansion or prep school or some trust fund to know who I am. I need her. Behind him, Janet wiped away a tear. She had walked into that courtroom expecting to lose everything, but she hadn't counted on her son being her warrior. I rest my case, David said simply. And for the first time in the history of that courtroom, no one, not even the judge, dared say a word. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child. No, it was the calculated, deliberate smile of someone who knew exactly when to play his strongest card. About education, David said, flipping open the final section of his notebook with surgical precision. May I share something interesting about Mr. Wellington's true educational plans for me? In that moment, Robert Wellington realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just a smart child. This was a strategist. His 9-year-old son hadn't just uncovered weaknesses. He had constructed a case so airtight, so devastating, that even his seasoned attorneys hadn't seen it coming. The courtroom leaned in, as if physically drawn toward the edge of what David was about to say. During one of my 4 visits to him over the last 9 years, David began with clinical calmness. I overheard a very interesting phone call. Judge Harrison's brows knit together. Across the room, Dr. Mitchell immediately stood up in alarm. Your Honor, private conversations cannot be. I can prove every word, David said, reaching into his backpack and pulling out a small digital recorder. Ms. Rodriguez taught me that documenting evidence is fundamental in any legal process. A jolt ran through the courtroom. You could feel it in the air, every lawyer, every clerk, even the judge, collectively holding their breath. This recording was made during Mr. Wellington's last visit to our apartment, David explained. He thought I was doing my homework in my room, but the recorder was left on in the living room. Judge Harrison gently took the device from David's outstretched hand, examining it. David, are you sure you want this to be submitted into evidence? Absolutely certain, Your Honor, the boy replied without hesitation. And then, the courtroom filled with the tinny but unmistakable voice of Robert Wellington, captured in chilling clarity. Listen, the voice said. As soon as I get legal custody, the boy's going straight to Riverside Military Academy. It's a strict boarding school in Colorado. They know how to deal with troubled kids. He'll stay there until he's 18, and I'll have full access to the inheritance funds for educational expenses. An audible gasp echoed from the gallery. Robert's face went ashen. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Exactly, the voice continued. $500 a month for boarding. The rest is mine. The kid doesn't even have to know about the money. It's perfect. She's out of the picture. I get the funds. I still look like a responsible father. Janet gasped audibly, her hands flying to her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. It was the first time she had heard any of this, and every word was a dagger. Dr. Mitchell looked like he might faint. His posture sank, his professional armor cracked. His client had just immolated his own case. There's more, David said calmly, pressing pause on the first section. He looked up, not with malice, but with a cold clarity that made grown men flinch. This part is about what he really thinks of me. He pressed play again. The problem isn't just the money, Robert's voice said on the tape. It's that the boy is too smart for his own good. He asks questions, observes everything. It'd be best to keep him out of the picture until he's 18, and I can get this whole financial mess sorted. Kids like him, we don't want him getting any ideas above his station. Robert Wellington shot to his feet, eyes wild with fury. This is a setup. He provoked me. That recording is taken out of context. A 9-year-old provoked you, David interrupted with scalpel-like precision. A 9-year-old can't be smart, can't defend himself, can't uncover the truth about a man who sees his own son as an obstacle to be managed. The silence was unbearable. You could hear the hum of the courtroom lights, the nervous shifting of shoes on the marble floor, the breath caught in dozens of throats. Judge Harrison turned off the recorder with a grave expression. Mr. Wellington, this recording, combined with the financial evidence and the witness testimony we've heard, paints a very clear and troubling picture of your true motivations. But David wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, standing taller now. I also researched Riverside Military Academy. He reached into his folder once more and handed over an official report. In the last 5 years, 3 students have committed suicide there. The institution is currently under federal investigation for physical and emotional abuse of minors. Judge Harrison's face darkened visibly as he read the highlighted excerpts. Dr. Mitchell made a final, desperate attempt. Your Honor, regardless of all this, the fact remains, my client can offer superior financial resources to support the child's growth and development. To do what? David cut in, his voice rising for the first time in hours. To send me to a place where children die. To use my inheritance money while pretending to care about me. To isolate me from the only person who has ever truly loved me. He turned toward Robert, who now looked like a shell of the arrogant man who had walked into that courtroom. You're nothing but an arrogant child who doesn't know his place. Robert snapped suddenly, the last veneer of civility torn away. David didn't flinch. You're not my father, he said, quietly but with blistering finality. You're a stranger who shares my DNA. A real father wouldn't try to get rid of his own son to steal his money. The room froze in stunned silence. It was the kind of moment that would be remembered for years, replayed in whispers in courthouse halls, told in classrooms as an example of courage, studied in law schools as a case that changed everything. David Thompson, 9 years old, armed with nothing but truth, a public library, and a mother's love, had just dismantled a man, an empire, and an illusion in a single afternoon. And he wasn't done yet. The judge banged his gavel sharply, the sound slicing through the chaos like a blade. Mr. Wellington, sit down immediately, or you will be removed from my courtroom, Judge Harrison warned, his voice thunderous with authority. But Robert Wellington had already frozen in place, his face drained of color, as David calmly flipped to the final page of his well-worn notebook. Your Honor, the boy began, his tone steady. There's one last thing I need to mention, something I discovered about why my grandmother really set up that trust fund. The tension in the courtroom thickened like fog. Robert Wellington, already pale, somehow turned even whiter. David's voice remained calm, but resolute. I found a letter from her in the estate files, a letter addressed to me, to be opened when I turned 16. But the librarian showed me that in cases of custody disputes, I could request early access. He paused, taking a deep breath. The next words would be the final blow. My grandmother wrote that she always knew Robert wasn't a good father. She established the trust specifically to protect me from him. And she made it clear, if he ever tried to get custody of me just for the money, I should use every resource in the trust to defend myself. A stunned silence gripped the courtroom. David slowly closed the notebook and looked directly at the man who had once tried to buy custody with greed rather than love. She even hired private investigators, David continued, and they documented all of his financial schemes over the years. It's all on file with the fund's administrator. Robert Wellington collapsed back into his chair, utterly defeated. He had underestimated his grandson, believing him to be a mere child, a pawn. But now he saw the truth. He had been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old armed only with intelligence, love, and a library card. Judge Harrison raised his gavel again. Based on all the evidence presented, including financial records, audio recordings, and the plaintiff's documented history, this custody request is categorically denied. Furthermore, I order a full investigation into the possible fraudulent use of trust funds. Dr. Mitchell leaned toward Robert, whispering urgently, but it was already over. The case was lost beyond recovery. David methodically packed away his materials, his every move deliberate, composed. Then he looked back up at the judge. Your Honor, may I make one final request? The judge nodded. You may, David. I want Mr. Wellington to understand that I didn't do this out of anger or revenge. I did it because every child deserves a family that truly loves them, not one that sees them as a financial opportunity. As security approached to escort Robert Wellington out of the courtroom, the judge announced his immediate arrest for attempted fraud. Robert, once a towering figure of arrogance and entitlement, was now reduced to a broken man in cuffs. David, for the first time, allowed himself a small smile. In that silent courtroom, it became unmistakably clear. A child calm, prepared, and determined, had just defeated money, manipulation, and privilege with nothing but truth and love. But David's victory wasn't just about custody. It signaled a shift, one that would ripple across the country and change lives far beyond his own. 3 years have passed since that unforgettable day in court. The boy who once stood alone in front of a judge and dismantled a man's greed with nothing but facts and principle had grown, not just taller, but into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The footage of the courtroom confrontation went viral, reaching millions across social media. The sight of a 9-year-old defending his mother with poise and clarity moved the nation. It sparked debates in legislative chambers, inspired new policies, and became the face of a rising movement. Children speaking up, demanding to be heard. The video had racked up over 50 million views. 17 U.S. states introduced or passed legislation expanding legal literacy resources for minors in custody cases. Now, 12-year-old David Thompson sat under the warm lights of America's most watched morning show. The host, glowing with admiration, leaned forward. "David, how does it feel to be called the smartest kid in America?" David, now a little taller, dressed in a neat shirt and wearing his signature glasses, gave a modest smile. "I'd rather just be called David. David who learned that every child has a voice, even when adults pretend not to listen." The studio audience erupted in emotional applause. Backstage, Janet Thompson watched her son from the wings, wearing the crisp uniform of her new role as nursing supervisor. After the trial, her story had ignited a national campaign in support of working mothers. The hospital where she worked established the Janet Thompson Program, a scholarship initiative for children of low-income employees. But it wasn't the attention that moved her. It was watching her son speak, not as a victim, but as a beacon for others. The host turned toward the wings. "And his mother is here with us today. Janet, how does it feel to see your son become an inspiration to millions of families?" Janet stepped onto the stage, shy yet proud, her composure giving way only slightly to emotion. "David has always been special," she said. "But what makes me most proud isn't just his intelligence. It's his heart. He could have used his story to boast, but instead, he used it to help other families. That's who he is." And it was true. Over the past 3 years, David had traveled to underserved communities, giving talks at schools, meeting with local youth programs, and explaining legal rights in ways children could understand. His book, Every Child Has a Voice, had become a national bestseller, and every dollar it earned went into a foundation providing free legal aid for families entangled in custody battles. "David," the host said, "tell us about the law library project you launched. That's been getting a lot of attention lately." David adjusted his glasses, a gesture that had become his quiet trademark, and answered, "After I saw how a public library helped me when I had nowhere else to turn, I started thinking, how many other kids are going through things like that, without knowing where to go? So we set up children's legal literacy sections in 1,200 public libraries. They have books written in simple language and computers with free access to basic legal resources." The camera zoomed in on Janet, her eyes glistening with quiet tears. In 3 short years, she had watched her son grow from a small boy fighting for her in court to a national symbol of resilience, advocacy, and hope. But not everyone was clapping. Across town, far from the cameras and bright lights, Robert Wellington watched the television from a cramped, windowless studio apartment in the suburbs of Chicago. His once flawless suit collection had been sold piece by piece. The financial empire he'd built on manipulation had crumbled after the investigation exposed years of fraudulent behavior. Disbarred, disgraced, and disowned, he now lived in anonymity, a fallen man haunted by the boy who had defeated him with nothing more than truth. On screen, David smiled as the audience rose in a standing ovation. The story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to every child who had ever felt invisible, every parent fighting quietly for love, and every courtroom where truth still had a chance. This wasn't just the aftermath of a legal victory. It was the birth of a movement. And David Thompson was just getting started. His hair had turned gray. His shoulders stooped under the invisible weight of disgrace, and the once arrogant posture had given way to quiet resignation. Robert Wellington now worked as a low-level salesman in a dusty electronics store on the edge of town, the only job he could get after his name became poison in the business world. The court-ordered investigation hadn't just revealed his attempt to steal his son's trust fund. It unraveled an entire web of fraudulent schemes, a financial empire built on lies. Wellington Industries collapsed overnight, leaving behind scorched earth. Robert lost it all: the gleaming glass headquarters, his sprawling mansion, his country club membership, his wife, and any shred of dignity he once possessed. Former partners turned enemies, suing him for millions. The final insult came when the gavel fell: 18 months in prison. Stripped of everything, he now lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where he kept the blinds closed and the television on mute, unless David appeared on the screen. On this particular evening, Robert had just settled into his worn recliner when a familiar voice echoed from the TV. "The boy's on again," he muttered bitterly, reaching for the remote. But something made him pause. There was David, now 12, seated calmly across from a talk show host, his posture composed, his voice confident. Robert's lip curled, but he didn't turn the TV off, just yet. In the 3 years since the trial, not a week had passed without David's story resurfacing in the media. The boy had become a symbol, a child who took on an empire and won. And yet, what tormented Robert most wasn't the headlines or the public humiliation. It was that David had never once spoken ill of him. No tabloid quotes, no televised bitterness. When asked about his biological father, David always answered with the kind of grace that made Robert feel smaller than he already was. "I hope he finds peace," David had said in a recent interview, "and learns that true love can't be bought or stolen. Holding a grudge doesn't help anyone, but setting boundaries, that's how we protect the ones we love." Those words played on a loop in Robert's mind, twisting like a knife. How could a boy he tried to manipulate now be the one showing him compassion? Back in the studio, the host leaned forward and asked her final question. "David, what advice would you give to children out there facing complicated or painful family situations?" David didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the studio lights, then turned and looked directly into the camera. "First," he began slowly, "you are not alone. Second, you have more power than you know. And third, the truth always finds a way to win, even when it feels impossible." His voice didn't tremble. If anything, it carried the weight of someone much older, someone who had faced giants and emerged victorious. "Don't let anyone tell you you're too small to make a difference," he continued. "I was 9 years old when I changed my life, and my mother's life forever. You can change yours, too." 6 months later, David received a letter that would forever hold a special place in his heart. It was from a 10-year-old girl in Los Angeles named Sophia Martinez. She wrote about how she'd used the cool LA Libraries program, David's brainchild, to help her immigrant grandmother fight off an unfair eviction. The letter ended with, "Thank you for teaching me that every child has a voice. I used mine, and I saved my family." Janet found David sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by hundreds of similar letters from children across the country. He held Sophia's letter in his hands, reading it for the 3rd time. Around him were shoeboxes filled with other messages, letters filled with courage, dreams, and newly discovered power. "How does it feel?" Janet asked softly from the doorway. "To know that your courage has inspired so many?" David carefully folded Sophia's letter and placed it into a special wooden box. "Do you remember when you told me that sometimes the scariest things in life turn out to be the most important?" Janet nodded, her eyes misting. She remembered saying those words the night he'd prepared for court, dressed in an oversized blazer and determination in his heart. "I think I understand now," David said. "If Robert Wellington had never tried to tear us apart, I would have never discovered that a child's voice can change the world once adults stop underestimating us." That same day, the phone rang, and once again, David's life pivoted in a direction no one could have predicted. Harvard University was launching a new pilot program in law and social justice, created specifically for under 16 students who had already demonstrated exceptional leadership in real-world social causes. David had been offered a full scholarship, the first ever recipient. Janet could barely speak when he told her. "Will you accept?" she finally asked. David smiled. "Yes, but on one condition." "What's that?" "I want to use my education," he said, his voice serious, "to build a legal system that protects all children, not just the lucky ones smart enough to defend themselves." Years later, David Thompson made history once again, this time as the youngest person ever admitted to the bar, just 16 years old. His first case? A landmark lawsuit against the public education system, accusing it of failing millions of children by not teaching them their basic legal rights. He won, and the ruling changed everything. Legal education for children became mandatory in all U.S. public schools, ensuring that no child would be as uninformed or unprotected as he once had been. The curriculum was named Thompson Rights, and it became a nationwide model. As for Robert Wellington, he never truly recovered. He worked modest jobs that barely paid his bills. Some nights, when the city had quieted and the memories crept in, he would think about his son. Not the child he tried to control, but the man that boy had become, righteous, fearless, and full of integrity. In his loneliest moments, Robert knew that David was the kind of man he had never been able to be. David Thompson's story became more than courtroom drama. It became a legend, a reminder that strength doesn't come from wealth, connections, or titles. It comes from intelligence, resilience, and love that refuses to bend under pressure. A 9-year-old boy had brought down corruption using nothing but a public library card, relentless determination, and a voice the world tried to silence. But he didn't just fight for justice. He changed the rules for every child who came after him. David learned that when you stand for what is right, the universe moves with you. Robert learned that underestimating a child with purpose may be the costliest mistake of all. And millions of children across the world learned something even more powerful, that their voices matter, their rights are real, and they are never too small to demand justice. David's greatest revenge wasn't destroying the man who tried to exploit him. It was building a legacy that would save thousands of families from the very same darkness he had once walked through.